Hello, Julia.
Hi, how are you?
All right, how about you?
Good. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. Me too. It's a pleasure to see you again. So, you and I have connected over the last year through the Lafayette 200 committee.
That's right, yes.
So, the Lafayette 200 committee, it includes also IU alum Thomas Carroll, who I knew during my time at Indiana University, and you got drawn into the project through someone else who's performing at the Bloomington Early Music Festival.
That's right. Dominic Giardino invited me, and as someone who mostly spent my time either in the Baroque era or on the other end in the classical and contemporary field, I was honored to be asked, of course, and I realized that there was a lot of work to do in this realm, early 19th century.
Yeah,
In dance specifically, but also in music, of course.
absolutely. And so, for folks who are not familiar with the Lafayette 200, this is a period where we are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the return of the Marquis de Lafayette, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or rather in the lead up to that. So, this has been something that's been going on across the country, and it's been a pleasure to get to meet other folks, whether from dance or musicology or historical performance, who are looking at this really critical moment in not only American music history, because there was so much music that was created for this, but in American history altogether. So, with that, Julia, would you be willing to talk about how you came to this project, this program that you're presenting tonight?
Yeah, sure. So I work as a choreographer, dancer, stage director, and I'm also the director of the New York Baroque Dance Company's New Baroque Initiative. I live just north of New York City, and that's my background. I started in classical ballet and ventured on to contemporary dance in my teens, and then I took on historical dance during my studies at the Royal Swedish Ballet School, and then my work with the New York Baroque Dance Company has dramatically shifted my career. So I really have one foot in the contemporary dance world, and then my other foot in mostly in Baroque dance research. And on this committee, I was really inspired by the idea of reaching further than I had gone in my own research. And I just happened to know the perfect person with expertise in early American dance. And with this, like you said, this year being so pivotal to the shaping of the American identity during this time, only 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I was just so intrigued by what was going on dance-wise in the US at this time. And also with the recent shift towards French culture, contrary from the English culture. It was just really interesting to me. So, Alan Jones, who had been dancing with my company before my time, he has been based in Paris for the past 30 years, and he is the person that I would contact with any questions regarding this time period. And he just so happened to have the perfect concept for the program that I would want to present as part of this commemoration. And he told me the story of Francis Johnson, a composer that I was not familiar with prior to talking to him. And what a fascinating figure, right? And what an incredible story. And then the fact that the original choreography to some of his compositions were widely available and sold through his with together with his sheet music, literally notated, line by line together with the sheet music, is just something that we don't see very often. And so it just seemed like the perfect project, the perfect story to tell um, a year ago and a year and a half ago when I first approached this project. And now I think it's more timely than ever.
Very much so, very much so. And I realized that we haven't introduced some of our main figures perhaps properly. So the Marquis de Lafayette, for folks who are not familiar with him, he came over to the U.S. as basically as a teenager. He was from a noble family, and he fought for the Patriot cause, was very close to George Washington. So he was an extraordinary figure of his generation, managed to survive the French Revolution, and then gets invited back in his old age. And Francis Johnson has an incredible career in Philadelphia. Was there, without spoiling anything from later on, is there anything more that you'd want to add about him right now?
Oh, wow. I mean, you'll hear a lot about him very shortly. So, I mean, anything that you think is relevant for our conversation. But he was a national celebrity who toured to Europe as the first American-born musician to do so, together with his band. Um, yeah, he's really someone you should know about.
A real American musical innovator. One of the things that you will be, one of the sort of central themes of this program is looking at the idea of the cotillion. So can you talk about what a cotillion means in an American context at this time, particularly as that can mean something different than it means both in contemporary American contexts and even elsewhere in the world in the early 19th century?
Certainly, just as yeah, the cotillion really means something different depending on where you are and when you are in the world. So during this time period, the cotillion was a social dance. It came from Europe. The cotillion was really more English, and the quadrille was really more French at this time. And what's interesting is that these dances were published by Johnson under the name of Francis Johnson's New Cotillions in honor of Lafayette. But they're really quadrilles, and that just speaks to this moment in time where the French influence had really taken over culturally after the American Revolution. Um, the cotillions were really less in fashion. The cotillion in the European sense was really less in fashion than the quadrilles. So these dances are really quadrilles. They're both social dances. They are to an outside eye, they have a lot in common. They're to regularly, pretty upbeat music, and they are different formations and changes. People move through space, and there's a lot of hopping and skipping usually in these dances. They're quite energetic, um, but they are two entirely different systems, I would say, and they feel different. They have things in common too. But they're really quite different. In America, however, and in other places in the world too, these terms um, really get confused a lot. And so, yeah, they're called cotillions, but they're really quadrilles, Johnson's dances. But in America, it can really mean anything. So you have to look at what the subject is, and from the you can tell right away from the structure of the dance what type of dance it really is.
Thank you. And this is something where I, as a musicologist and a historian, am so grateful for people with expertise in dance and dance history like you, because when I'm looking at sheet music, this is knowledge that I don't have. I like contra dancing, and
Me
that
too.
has yeah, and that has some links to this, but I'm so grateful for this very specific expertise that you're bringing, and also for the way that you're. I like how graciously you put it, the idea that the idea that a cotillion isn't necessarily something that has to have one sort of static meaning, that things can evolve, and um, rather than looking at things whether I guess, whether it fits the paradigm of a cotillion or not, it's this interesting sort of new synthesis um, of French and English traditions, which is, as we've talked about in some other contexts, something that is so um, this sort of dynamic of this early American Republic, whether we're looking at things, whether we're looking at, for example, pleasure gardens, and that there's a paradigm that's more attuned to England and then one that's more attuned to France, although the English are borrowing from the French with their pleasure gardens anyway. With this synthesis, it's always dynamic. And so thank you for bringing your expertise to this particular point in time. I was wondering if, because again, this process of historical dance research is something that is really complex and specialized, but also it has a lot of, there also are parallels with other sorts of historical research. Could you describe your research process, perhaps some of the sources that you've used? You've already mentioned some of the publications. And then maybe some of the obstacles that you found along the way too.
Yeah, the big obstacle always with a project like this, to be perfectly transparent, is always going to be the funding. And so that really sets the bar for, it sets the limit for what we can do. Because our own bar is always so high, right? And we're just trying to make the our resources last as long as possible. And so yeah, that's our main obstacle because the knowledge and the talent is there, and we just have to access it by giving these people the time to invest in it, in this material. And so, yeah, I mentioned Alan Jones. He's really someone that I respect so much. I had the pleasure of working with him a little bit earlier, especially during the pandemic over Zoom, and I was familiar with his work, but I had never had a chance to work on him with him so closely and with this time period, which is just beyond his real expertise era. So I think it was a stretch for us all, but particularly for me, coming from the 18th century really into a whole new century, which bridges my knowledge really, given that I spent so much of my time in the Baroque era but my whole childhood and adolescence was in classical ballet, and I went to Royal Swedish Ballet School for 10 years. And so I have all of that as well. And so this linked my areas of expertise in many ways, but it also exposed me to so much entirely new stuff that is particular to the 19th century and that we don't really find later at all in classical ballet. So just really fascinating altogether. Alan had spent about 20 years in this realm before, early American, French influenced dancing. And there's a lot to draw upon because we know a lot about the dancing masters. A lot of his research is about the dancing masters who were working in America at this time. A lot of them are French or they come from the French islands. There's a lot of French influence, of course. And some dancers also brought over from France. The sources, and he was able to, given his vast knowledge, he knew where to look. So that was, more than I knew. So trying to make this a year and a half, condensing it just a little bit. We were lucky enough to get funding from Centre National de la Danse in France, who supported this research project into French influence in American dancing, and particularly Philadelphia in 1824. We used a Franco-American treatise written by Victor Guillot, Arts and Principles of Dancing, and that was in turn a translation and slight reworking of a French treatise that was published in Paris just a few years earlier by Jean-Henri Gourdodot. And so Alan is familiar with both these sources, but we looked into the Philadelphia treatise in particular because we wanted to get the real American technique. And it was published in 1817, which is very close. It's very close to the 1824 event that we were looking at here, the Lafayette Grand Ball in Philadelphia, which was one of the most prestigious events, of course, in the whole tour of Lafayette. And let's see, so the dance steps that these choreographies call for, Francis Johnson's dances call for, are described closely in the Guillot treatise. So that is amazing.
Oh yeah.
Same city and very close in time. But then that wasn't quite enough, of course, because it's never enough. So Alan brought in his earlier research too, specifically the Depriot treatise, which is in the Paris Opera Library, if I'm not misremembering. And then he has also studied the Saint Leon manuscripts and all of them. Also, the Spanish dance was a huge. The idea of the Spanish dance was a huge inspiration to composers all over the world. Francis Johnson never went to Spain during his lifetime, as far as we know, but he wrote several Spanish dances. And this particular Spanish dance could have been composed for a young woman playing castanets, for example. That was quite common in dance schools, for example, that young women were performing, or even at a home, you could perform a dance for your guests with castanets. And so we looked at the living tradition of the Escuela Bolera. Specifically, again, Alan looked at it, and I was just trying to soak up everything I could from him and his collaborators. And then, so that was specifically the Spanish dance. And so there's an equivalent for each dance in the program. There's an equivalent story of how we were able to trying to travel back in time and get as close as we could technique wise. Let's see if there's a particular source. No, I think that's plenty. That's a long story already.
Well, thank you for sharing that because I think that this is one of the things that is, it's something that when you're reading through research, it's sometimes you have to sort of dig down into the footnotes to see what's going on, and still then also construct your own narrative about sort of the archival process. So thank you for sharing that. I think that that is um, really, really critical to understand that in the arts, we're not just passing down traditions, we are doing active research, and there is still much more research to be done, whether we're looking at French influence in the early American Republic. I don't think I've shared with you. I deal with some of that with looking at Norfolk, Virginia in the 1790s and the very early 1800s, because they have at one point the highest per capita influx of French and French Caribbean refugees of anywhere in the United States. And when these French and particularly French Caribbean refugees come in, um, they end up being the ones to really invigorate the entertainment industry. So pleasure gardens and long rooms, and the travelers who go through talk about actually specifically about the quadrilles, that
Mm.
how the French refugees, the young women, how they'll be shop girls during the day, and then they will dance away their sorrows at night to quadrilles. So, but in Norfolk, we have very, very little documentation from that French refugee community itself. And even though they become really critical to the infrastructure of the city, and I know that you and I have also talked about how it's a challenge with looking at any sort of marginalized or underrepresented group in the archives when we're looking back at the early 19th century. And so it's really thrilling to see this whole festival theme of music in the African diaspora and its intersection with early music, and see that this is highlight this there's other highlighting of Black musicians in the early American Republic, like with the Early Music Access Project, and looking at the Hemmings family of Monticello and Charlottesville. And so I want to toss this back to you, but you can also feel free to toss it back to me. Anything you'd like to chime in there or add?
Well, just agreeing with what you said there. It's such an important story to tell, the story of Black musicianship in early America and onwards, of course. But
Oh
I
yeah.
was surprised at how little we hear about it and how little we read about it. And then, looking into it, it is there, and it's so obvious that it has been erased, sadly, by those who tell history. And yeah, I'm just happy that we can raise this subject and really and talk about it. Um, there were so many Black fiddlers leading dances around America at this time, and Johnson was one of them and extremely prolific. And so it feels really important to be telling the story at this time.
Yeah. So again, um, thank you for those comments. I'm going to say that in Virginia we talk about Cy Gilliat, and he was in Williamsburg, and then he was when it was the colonial capital, and then in Richmond, which becomes the capital, um, uh, in during the early American Republic. And one of the things that's so frustrating is it's obvious that to um, he is central um, to Richmond's social life, and he is not only a Black fiddler, but he's someone who is playing courtly music too. So we have that image of the Black fiddler, but he was also very famous for wearing very stately dress, and he is this sort of icon of elite Richmond sociability. And people mention him and sort of like, okay, of course you know about him. It's like, great, but they didn't actually record very much information about him, and he didn't leave very much information behind either. And so we're trying to piece things together from different sources. And I know that I'm really excited to see how in the next decade and beyond, we're able to see that figures like Francis Johnson, while they are exceptional in their skill and their expertise, they also are highlighting much broader narratives um, of communities that have been left out of music historical narratives. The free Black community in Philadelphia, in Virginia, there's Black musicians. Some are enslaved, some are free, and some are first enslaved and then become free. I think that there's so much more research that we can do, but it's going to take looking into records that we haven't looked before, like tax records or um, uh, other sorts of legal documents where we can find traces that don't necessarily appear in traditional sort of music or dance archives. With that, let's wrap up. And this is a question I told you that I always like to talk with people about what hope and encouragement and inspiration they take away from their historical research, from their projects, because it's easy to see the flaws, to see the patterns that you wish weren't there. And yet this whole moment with Lafayette is such an incredible point in American history. I mean, it's literally part of the era of good feelings, which while it doesn't while the era of good feelings doesn't last and we end up going into a more strident era, the era of Andrew Jackson and Jacksonianism, the era of good feelings and Lafayette's tour, it's really incredible to realize that the country was wanting to look back at its past. It wasn't afraid to be looking back at history, and it was honoring a generation that was about to pass away, and trying to give something good um, for young folks to help unify the country going forward. What encouragement and inspiration would you say that you found in this project, or that you would like to share with others?
In looking into all the work that we had to in order to create this program. The initial story that sparked my inspiration and hope is really remains the story of Francis Johnson, that we are really the best when we lift each other up, and that someone of his talent really can take the world quite literally, um, and have such an incredible career. That remains my hope through this. And so I know that that's when we are at our best, and I'm excited to share this program broadly over the next few years and tell that story of beauty. Mm.
I'm excited. I'm excited for it too, and it's not just a Philadelphia story. As we've also talked about in some of our conversations, Francis Johnson's music, it ends up being collected by women across the country. I deal with it mostly with women in Virginia who are collecting it, but he is, his story. It's a Philadelphia story. It's a story of free Black musicians in the early American Republic, and it's a national story too, and it's wonderful the way that that your research is drawing together those different strands. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you at more Lafayette 200 Music Committee meetings,
I hope so, if I can ever make make them.
and hopefully in person one day too. So hopefully in person one day. But until then, it's been a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for having this conversation and adding your perspective. It's been really great.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Right. And folks in Bloomington, and have a great time. Bloomington in May is such an incredible place to be, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.